I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. Today we're going to build a simple box joint jig for use on the table saw. The jig's simplicity comes from the fact that we're using the factory miter gauge as the basis for this jig. So it's using the miter gauge's bar to slide in the slot in the table and the miter gauge fence to keep it 90 degrees to the blade. If there's a downside to that, it's that the accuracy of this jig is directly proportional to the accuracy of the miter gauge that came with your table saw. Now this is the factory gauge that came with this table saw. It has a steel bar about 18 inches long. It has a die cast head that has stops at 90 and 45 degrees in either direction, plus granulation so that way you can set it to whatever angle you want. This is the miter gauge that came with my benchtop table saw, and as you can see, it's a whole different class of miter gauge than this one. It has a short little hollow aluminum bar and it has a little plastic head. There are no stops on this thing, so you have to set it to 90 degrees every time you change from one angle to another. However, that's not to say I can't use this in my benchtop table saw and get just as good results as this one in the stationary saw. It's just going to be a little bit more work on my part. Here, I can be pretty confident when I slide it back and forth that it's going to stay 90 degrees to the blade. This one, on the other hand, if I put this one in, you can see this one really rattles side to side. Well, I can compensate for that by how I use it. If I remember to always push at this angle, so I take up the slop because I'm twisting it just a little bit, I can now slide it back and forth all I want and I'm going to get a consistent angle. As long as I don't start moving it side to side, it'll be okay. I take up the slop, whereas this one doesn't have that slop to begin with. In the past, I've found a 5-inch tall fence on the box joint jig seems to be just about right. The fence is going to get screwed to the miter gauge using these two holes that are already in the miter gauge from the factory, and I'm going to use some of these pocket hole screws because they have this flat washer head which works really well with these pre-drilled holes. The only issue I have is because this is only 1/2-inch thick plywood, that doesn't give me a lot of material for the screw threads to grab, and if you look, these 1.5-inch long screws would actually stick out the front. The other thing is I'm going to be cutting notches in the bottom of this thing, and as soon as I start doing that, it's going to weaken it, and I'm afraid this thing's going to start flexing too much. So to get around that, I have a scrap piece of plywood that's 3/4 inch thick, that's the same height as the fence on the miter gauge. I'm simply going to glue and screw this piece of plywood to this one, so that way the screws have something to grab into, and it beefs up this bottom edge a little bit to hopefully resist some of the flexing from when I start cutting notches in this. A little bit of wood glue and some 1-inch drywall screws is all it's going to take to hold these two pieces of plywood together. Now I want to make sure to countersink for the drywall screws so that way the head is below the surface so it doesn't interfere with the work pieces that I send through the jig. Also, I want to make sure that this bottom edge remains flush so that way it rides on the table of the table saw smoothly. And I want to make sure to only put the screws on the outer edge because in here I might hit them with the Dado Head and that would be an expensive mistake. Now it's time to replace the saw blade on the table saw with the Dado Head. And if there's one tip I can give you, it's make sure that the dust collector is turned off to the saw when you take that arbor nut off, because if you drop it down in there, it's one thing to fish it out of the bottom of the saw, it's a whole other game to go and dig it out of the sawdust collection bin at the bottom of the cyclone. Ask me how I know. I'm aiming for a 3/8 wide groove, so I'm going to use the 2 1/8" outer saw blades and 1 1/8" chipper in the middle. And we will see how close I get. Now I want to try this on some scrap wood first, so if I have to make adjustments with some brass shims, I can, and it won't be chewing up the bottom of my jig. And here I have a throat plate that I use with the Dado Head, because I don't want to wreck the zero clearance insert with this big blade. Now I'm not too concerned about the height of the Dado Head, I just want to see what I'm getting for a width to see if I need to adjust this thing. So let's see how we did. And that looks perfect right there. So I'm not going to mess with it. So the width is right. Now I want to set the height. And I want the height of this first cut to be 1/4 inch. So if I set this to 1/4 inch, I can see just a little bit of space there. So I want to raise this just a little bit. Now this saw has a knob on the front that lets me lock the height of this thing in place. And I like to tighten that down just a little bit when I'm using the Dado Head so it doesn't drop back down. Now I'll run another pass and see what I get. That is a perfect 1/4 inch right there, so I'm going to leave it alone. Now we can go ahead and attach the jig. Now I can go ahead and screw the jig to the miter gauge. And I can pass it through the saw blade. Now I need to cut a key out of some hardwood, and I have this maple scrap kicking around, so I'm going to use it. And it needs to be 3/8 inch wide and 1/4 inch tall to match the dado we just cut in the box joint jig. So what I'm going to do is use my other table saw, because I don't want to have to take the Dado Head out of the other one. If you only have one table saw, then you're going to need to take the Dado Head out and put the saw blade back in. I just so happen to have this little tabletop saw. Now let's check the fit. And that's a nice snug fit side to side. It protrudes down out of the bottom of the jig just a little bit, and that's a problem because that means the jig won't ride flush on the table saw. So what I'll do is mark this pin right here, and I'll cut it off with my dovetail saw, and then I'll simply plane it down just a little bit with the block plane. And after a little bit of work with the block plane, that fits nicely. And it's just a little bit below the bottom, and that's fine, because again, this is the reference surface, not the pin. One final thing I want to do is just chamfer these top two corners a little bit, and that'll make it just a little bit easier to slide the boards onto this as I move from finger to finger. That again will be done just with the block plane. Now I want to just glue it in there. Don't have to go nuts with the glue, just enough to hold it. And I want to put one screw in it to hold it until the glue is fully dry. Now I made sure to countersink that so it doesn't scrape on the table of the saw, and I made sure to pre-drill it because that wood is very hard and it's very small and I don't want it to split. Now we can go ahead and take this to the table saw and do the final adjustment. Now for the tricky part, and that is we need to space this pin the same distance as it is wide away from the dado head. Right now it's directly in line with the dado head. The easiest way to do it is to bring the table saw fence over until it just barely touches the jig and lock it down. Now I want to make sure I can still slide the jig so it's not crushing it, but it's still rubbing on it, and it is. Now I can go ahead and unscrew the 2 screws we put in the jig before. Move them out of the way. And I have 2 more pieces of the same 1/4 inch by 3/8 pin that I used there. I've got them held together, and I'm going to put them between the jig and the fence. That has now set it away from the fence, the width of 2 of those pins, and so there's 1 pin width between the dado head and that pin. Now I can go ahead and, while I keep pressure on the fence, I can go ahead and install the screws in their new locations. There. Now I can remove those, get the fence out of here, and if we look, we should have exactly the width of one of these pins between the dado head and here. And we do. Okay, let's go ahead and try it out. So I've got 2 pieces of wood that I'd like to join with box joints, and they're 1/2 inch thick. So what I would do is first raise the dado head up until it is just barely above the surface of the wood, about a 1/64 of an inch. That means the pins are going to stick out about a 1/64 of an inch, but I can sand those down flush afterwards. It's a lot easier to sand the pins down flush than to have to sand the entire side of the box down because the pins don't stick through. I'm going to set one of these aside for right now and just focus on the first one. The order of operation is like this. This first one, I'm going to butt up against the pin here and send it through. Once I send it through, I'm going to set it over on the new notch, cut it again, and keep working my way along till the end. Now for board number 2, what I want to do is take this first one, flip it around so the first full pin is sticking out, and I'm going to butt the second board up against it, just like this. Now I want to take this board out of here so the saw blade doesn't score that top part, and I want to start all over again. Now if we take the 2 pieces and we put them together, we'll see what kind of joint we have. And that looks pretty good. A little bit of glue and some clamps, and I think that's going to be a nice box joint right there. So that is how simple it is to build a box joint jig. I've used the jig for a couple minutes now, and I'm already covered in sawdust from all the dust that comes through this notch right here. So I'm putting this piece of 5/4 pine on to act as a little dust shield. There. Now after a couple passes with that, you can see how if I don't go all the way through, It'll keep the dust contained, and it'll have to go down under the table where the dust collector can deal with it.